We're back with episode 11 of the Three Body Problem, a podcast on the Security Conversations Network. I'm here with Costin Raju, checking in from Bucharest, Romania. What time is it out there, Costin?
8 p.m.
8 p.m.
Vacation
How's
time.
life?
Life's good. I'm just back from vacation. I was in France this week, so now I'm back home.
I can't keep up with you on your
vacation.
vacations.
You're at a conference, man. You gotta. You sell
He's
yourself
milking
short.
this vacation thing.
Yeah, he's playing into the theme.
Juan Andres, how are you, my friend?
Good, man. Good. Just starting to feel like things are kind of put together. LabsCon sold out. Things, the agenda's final. So now we can just enjoy what's coming.
Can't believe it's
costumes and shit.
Can't believe there's no work to be done. Yeah, the meme costumes will be fun.
Don't fucking say that. Don't say there's no work to be done. Like my talk is not ready. I gotta.
Let's pivot to the news because people are complaining that our episodes are a little too short, so we have to
get into
it a little. I get into it a little earlier. The big story, obviously, yesterday, the U.S. government dropped like a series of announcements with their allies and partners around Europe about this Russian GRU unit that's previously been tied to assassinations and some pretty hardcore things, now caught doing cybersecurity, now caught doing cyber attacks, and pinpointing and linking them to this the Viper attacks in Ukraine just before the war broke. Juan, I'll start with you because you guys tracked that Viper malware attack in detail when it happened. Does this surprise you that it's coming out to this unit? I'm trying to understand what's the implications of this unit now doing cyber.
Oh, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, the whole thing is super interesting. And I'll say that even, you mentioned sort of doing the tracking on our end. It was really interesting because when the invasion of Ukraine happened, and even right before it, when you start to see sort of these Whispergate ops and black-white ransomware and so on, there was this sense, there was speculation that there was some other group, right? Like some other group has come online that's doing things that's not what we're used to. It's not what we have been dealing with, right? You had just a different MO, different TTPs, different types of malware. And it was all too frenetic at the time to really know what we were dealing with or who we were dealing with. And frankly, it didn't necessarily matter, right? Like at the time, we were just invested in trying to stop these attacks, trying to get as much intel as possible, learn how we're going to cluster these things and so on. But eventually you have to sit back and wonder about the ontology once again and go, who are these players and, who's shown up to the party. So it's nice to have a kind of clustering and, Microsoft did it first, right? They came out, they said it's Cadet Blizzard and you're like, cool, you named it. I don't know why. Credit where credit is due, looking back on the Cadet Blizzard release and some of the folks that were involved working that, it's abundantly clear that they had way more intel, that they eventually figured out that the cluster looked a lot more interesting than it did, and then they gave it a name. So I think this is kind of coming in a very timely way to say, look, this is the reality of what we're dealing with, and it's far scarier, far more problematic, and far more GRU than I think any of us would have called it, right? Like you've got the same folks doing Sabotage, Havana Syndrome, Poisonings, and Cyber. And you're like, all right, something's happening there.
Is this unique, Costin? Is it unique to find that the same, let's call them military unit doing a variety of different things, including what they're connecting here?
Well, I mean, these guys are super famous for all sorts of failed assassinations in Europe. Skripal poisoning comes to mind. They also tried to poison a Bulgarian arms dealer. They tried to blow up an arms depot, I think, in Czech Republic, which was successful. I think most recently, I'm not sure if it was the same unit, but they tried to assassinate the CEO of Rheinmetall, a German military producer. So they're famous for mostly, if you want, kinetic operations, assassinations. There's also this suspicion that they were behind the so-called Havana Syndrome attempts, which are, in my opinion, a very, very serious thing. People are, still debating, it's like a radio weapon, like essentially remotely frying someone's brain from the distance, which is pretty scary, in my opinion. And the fact that these guys are now going into cyber as well, obviously they're maybe not as good as the other big groups, but the first time when I heard that, we're linking this to unit 29155, I thought it was a mistake. I was like, no, these are like the other guys with the poisonings. But I was, no, they are now doing cyber as well. So I think maybe it's an interesting evolution, which also suggests that at the moment, cybernetic warfare, if you want, is just as important as all the other things. It has become as important.
One of the
I
things
think
they announced yesterday was this indictment as well against one of these guys. I got the thing on the screen here with these 29155 cyber actors. And the NCSC statement made a point that these were low-level keyboard, hands-on keyboard guys. What's the importance of doing indictments? One, what's the reason for Justice Department getting involved in doing this?
you packed several questions into that, all of which kind of make me not uncomfortable, but I have a lot of thoughts about some of these things, right? So,
And
I mean,
I asked it for a specific reason, but go ahead.
well, what is the reason for doing indictments? I think you have to answer that from a U.S. perspective, and there's this notion, there's the symbolic side of it, and then there's the logistical side of it. The symbolic side of it is, well, we're putting we're going to put some faces on the fridge. We're going to say, you guys did a bad thing. This is not appropriate. And it's sort of this notion that despite it being just the way the Russian government is willing to act, you're basically saying like, look, we have to take a stand and make this seem reprehensible and to put some faces to it and hopefully put some friction to it, right? Like these guys will not, in their right mind, will not travel to places where they could get picked up and so on. But it feels like pretty small potatoes in some ways. That said, I think there's a greater power to actually doing the indictments, which is starting to unlock other law enforcement powers and other sorts of things that you might otherwise have a harder time justifying when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to money movements. And, we're going to talk about Doppelganger as well. If you pay attention to that affidavit, they're even talking about trading in counterfeit goods, which is a really weird backwards way of trying to use the law to say, how the hell do we use existing law to try to problematize and prosecute cyber activity that we just don't have laws for? We don't have explicit. So in a way, it's kind of like a nothing burger, like, oh, well, this seems really small and stupid. We're never going to grab these dudes. In another, there's a kind of pro forma legal power unlocking that comes with being able to point to say, there is an active indictment, there are red notices, there are other aspects of law enforcement that are hopefully going to unlock greater powers to go after them. But for us, it's just having posters, right? Like we can put some stuff on the wall in the office, right?
This 29155, what's the equivalent? Is there an equivalent in the West? Is there an equivalent in the US? And is there an equivalency as well with the mixing of, what these military contractors do and what cyber warriors do?
I'm sorry, I would hesitate to say there's an equivalence at all, primarily because there's so many reprehensible actions wrapped into what 29155 is in the first place, just from the sake of like, will the West do something like this? And as much as people can wear their tinfoil hats and they can come at us with all their like anti-West bullshit, no, there are not. Maybe there are ways in which we could discuss how some of these activities have been partially perhaps done in this way and the other, but no, there's no such thing as like having a military unit that's doing poisonings in these places, sabotage these other places, coups, and cyber. But I think the more important lesson,
let me ask you
here,
this: hasn't there been CIA malware found somewhere along the line?
Sake.
I mean,
yeah,
Is the CIA poisoning people? There is, by the way, there is maybe one case. Well, obviously, if you are to believe Ronan Bergman's books, the GRU Unit of the Mossad that was going after terrorists, former Nazi, they were pretty much doing all these things back in the days.
Well, they definitely tried to. They did try to poison. What was it, Hamas leader?
Yeah,
Hezbollah
in
leader?
Jordan.
Yeah, that did not go well.
And one in Dubai, correct?
Yeah. But
no, I don't want to pretend there's equivalence. I'm just trying to like balance the conversation. Is this a thing that nation states and we're just kind of getting excited?
We're rolling too many things into one. And this is what happens.
Parse it for me.
Well, this is what happens with these fucking conversations is we end up creating these moral equivalencies, which actually play into how governments, like specifically the Russian government, wants us to think about this. When you go, guys, this is incredibly fucked up. You're doing things that, civilized nation states do not do. They go, but those guys did it, and they did it here, and they do it there, and so the CIA must do it, and the West does it. The real problem is the answer is yes, we all do it if you let go of all nuance and detail and understanding about those specific cases and just roll it up into this jumble of, the same way that people won't shut up about how, like, oh, the CIA destabilized Latin America in the 60s. You go, stop, right? That's a one-handed handshake, right? The KGB had 3 times as many people in Latin America at the time, but somehow that's not worth discussing, right? Like, there's a lot of ways in which you let the nuance drop from the subject, and then you get these like sort of overly generalized statements. I'm not trying to whitewash the West's intelligence operations. What I'm saying is we have some really stupid conclusions that come from removing a lot of characters and a lot of important details from it, and we end up with the same narrative that the tinfoil hat, I'm getting shot with a cancer weapon people on the internet like to espouse. And there's a much more nuanced way to look at this. If we can go back to 29155 and the question that you asked, actually, I think it's incredibly interesting for us to talk about how the Russians, and particularly the GRU's, views of warfare, information operations, and cyber are radically different from what everybody else does. Right? There is an element in which clearly they are running with their concept of information ops and this sort of notion of general destabilization of cyber, not as its own component, but rather as just another support pillar towards a greater type of trying to meet objectives. And in that, they are much more flexible and they're much scarier, right? Like you can look at, what is your objective? Your objective is to destabilize an organization, to take away support for Ukraine, for example. Okay, in the West, were that to be one of our objectives, then you would have separate units with separate domains and types of operations that may attempt to take on that goal. And they will do it in this sort of like semi-siloed way unless we have some like joint task force somewhere. In the Russian way of doing this, the same people that can decide to poison or microwave the shit out of your brain or go and blow up an arms cache or try to set up a coup or do some destructive malware operations or steal a bunch of info and try to leak it. Like, you have this sort of intertwined braid of the notion of how military operations are supposed to go, of which cyber is just one enabler that will play into it the same way that chemical weapons are. And that's really interesting. That's a big shift and at least distinction between us and them.
Costin, to be fair though, this conversation takes on a very US-centric tone for the most part, especially the ones that I hear. And Juan is like Mr. USA here, so I'm I want to leave him out of this question here. All right.
It's the entourage.
You guys do you. You do you. Right.
Are we worried about reciprocity when other countries try to pinpoint our keyboard warriors? John Smith in Virginia gets picked up in some random countries trying to vacation because he's been tied to RM Green or something. I mean, when I ask the question about these being low-level keyboard warriors, we have those here not only in the US but in the West. I mean, every nation has them. Is there a worry there? And two, from a research perspective, when guys who are doing poisonings and brain fryings are doing cyber now, are you guys a little at all worried about doing any sort of exposés and fourth-party collection?
Oh dear.
I was told to stay out of this one, so it's all you.
Not yet. I'll bring you in a second.
Can I answer the first one first? Go. Yeah, and maybe skip the second. But yeah, the first on the first point, I was wondering like what keeps Russia or China from doing the same, indicting a U.S. Intelligence officer in the same manner. I think the only thing which stops them from doing that is OPSEC. That's it, OPSEC. Otherwise, if they had the ability to identify and determine exactly who was behind the keyboards, who was operating that thing and this thing and the other thing, I think they would do the same. Maybe they don't realize it yet. It seems, in my opinion, there's some kind of a delay in Russia and China adopting the same tools and methods as the West in terms of sanctions, in terms of indictments. There's a delay there. And this was, I think, most visible in terms of attribution and in terms of exposing adversaries. Like in
Which we're
the
starting to see out of China now, right?
yeah,
We're starting to see a
exactly.
very
So
deliberate, aggressive effort to start to be like, oh, we're going to
But a
do
fucking
APT exposés.
stupid
They're not
one.
very good.
yeah, but listen, I remember a long time ago. I remember a discussion with Chinese researchers who were asking in a very surprised and shocked manner, how come that your party advisors allow you to expose these Western APTs? And we were like, we don't have party advisors. That's simple. But what I take it from the story is that there was some kind of a party directive, or there was like some kind of government influence to stop people from exposing adversaries in a public mode. But now that's happening as well, right? Chihu published on the Lamberts, who was anti-labs. They published on a bunch of equation tools. Pangu published on Straight Bizarre, and so on. I think that these exposures continue.
You say there's a delay, which
There's
suggests
a
that it's
delay.
coming.
I think it's coming, yeah. When maybe they already have this ability, maybe they already know who is RM Green, maybe they already know who is behind this and that thingy, and they're just preparing the same. But I do remember a discussion also for a couple of years ago when people in the West were saying that it's not right to indict essentially officers on the other side.
That's why I asked the question,
Yeah, typically this is like, it's not happening, right? It's not something that's happening normally, because the enemies, the adversaries, can do the same to your officers. So, in my opinion, this is coming maybe in a couple of years, maybe sooner. But I think that Russia, China, and maybe even Iran will adopt the same methods and the same tools, because I think at some point they'll realize that they're effective and they do bring fear, stress, to
It
those
just takes
people,
one
to their
guy getting
families.
picked up on a vacation in Bali somewhere for this to start to, become a big issue here. And that's why I raised the question when they mentioned these guys were low-level keyboard warriors. On the collection of stuff, is there any sort of personal nervousness around this at all?
I mean, we will die glorious deaths.
And go to heaven.
Yeah, so 72 something.
No, I mean, when two guys are going to walk around like looking for a beautiful cathedrals in some European city and then go around poisoning
There
people.
are no spires out here.
So my advice to you guys, start training in Taekwondo.
There we go. I want to go back to
If you
this.
want to have a chance when the people show up,
Quickly on this
training Taekwondo.
29155 thing, CISA put out a big, long, detailed advisory that includes all kinds of tradecraft, victimization, industry
I'm
tracking,
not sure it got edited.
IOX, and I want to ask about the quality of YARA rules because that's a recurring thing. Have you guys looked at this? And Kostin, you already gave me the reaction that I was looking for. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you describe the quality of CISA rules, and what can be done to fix it? I mean, is it a human thing there? What do you think? Why do you think they keep getting this wrong?
So this is like first of all, I need to say that it's not just me. Like, yeah, maybe I'm the one who's always complaining, but I like to think that actually I'm some of the most moderate people out there, like complaining about that. But I was thinking, like, listen, how many people work for CISA? It's like 3, 4, 5,000, and maybe several $1 billion in budget.
3.
Let me ask you a very simple question. What are your expectations from a cybersecurity company with 4,000 people and $3 billion budget? What are your expectations? Like my expectations would be, okay, first an EDR, a pretty decent one, to be able to produce threat intelligence reports, to be able to do incident response, to push blog posts, at least like 100 private reports per year, and at least like 24 blogs or public reports. Again, 4,000 people, $3 billion.
But
Is
CISA
this
isn't
like
just
the kind
writing.
of stuff that you see out of CISA? I don't know. I'm just asking the question.
It's a fair question. It's something that popped up when you were on vacation and Dave Vitale was on the show, and I asked people to explain to me what is the success stories out of CISA. Juan, you're pretty well plugged into that part of the world. How do you answer the question? Is there a fair return on our CISA investment?
Man, why would you set me up like that?
Because it's like,
No, I don't think there is. And I mean, I've said as much. And
But it's not
I'm
a
a,
money problem. It's not a people problem. As Costin explained, they're up to 2023 numbers were what, 3,500 people and $2.9 billion a year budget, which was increased the year after. So that's a lot of money and a lot of people.
I think it's a lot. It's a lot of money, a lot of people. If our measure of things is why do their YARA rules suck, which there is no excuse for that, frankly. Especially because I mean, look at the 12 logos that are on that thing. Some of those logos write some pretty good YARA rules. CNMF knows how to write YARA rules. The Brits. I mean, GCHQ, NCSC, they provide great stuff. It's never got false positives. They actually work with industry people and test their rules. So there is really not a lot of excuse other than I don't know what kind of silos of excellence mentality they're playing with here. But at the same, since you're asking a much broader question, the bigger issue with CISA is it's a lot of money and a lot of people for a small threat intel goal. It's not enough money and not enough people for the portfolio of ever expanding, never limiting goals and authorities that CISA seems to want and continue to strive for and ask for. And that's why it feels like too little too late across the board, because you want to be the infrastructure agency. You want to be the collaboration with industry agency. You want to be the disinformation agency. You want to defend the government. You want to be the only ones doing threat intel on the US side. You want to do X, Y, and Z. So you just keep expanding your remit without a very strong base, without a very strong foundation of technical capabilities. So no, you're never going to be able to succeed. You're never going to be able to actually do enough. And when it comes to something like this, which I'll point out, it may seem like a small goal, but producing threat intel tends to require the more exquisite levels of expertise. You are going to fall short, especially if you're not actually taking advantage of the partners that you have, right? I don't know why whomever is writing these rules, they suck at them. We've been talking about how much they suck for years. I've been complaining about this for years. I've offered free trainings to them, and I will say at least one agency took me up on it, and it was not CISA. So you have people who are doing this well, who are collaborating with you. Why don't you just take their fucking rules, right? What are you doing? So
And
each to their
why isn't
strengths.
it happening? Is that a cultural thing? Is it just some personality thing? IOCs and YARA rules in our world is the most important thing. We don't give a crap about telling people how to turn on two-factor authentication. That should be not normal. You're spending a ton of cycles on that.
Different goals.
Yeah. I think Juan is right here. It's just different goals. I mean, if you start reading the reports, so now I'm going to start nitpicking on the reports.
Please nitpick, because this one especially was impossible to read, at least for me.
Yeah.
They didn't edit this shit at all. Let's just copy-paste it.
Copy-paste shit from everywhere.
The report starts with 20 agencies. So this FBI with that, 20 different agencies.
3 paragraphs of a list of agencies.
I don't care about that. Who is the audience for the reports? If it's technical people like me, I don't care. It's just say CISA together with partners. That's it.
Yeah, but would you read it if it was just CISA?
What's that?
Sorry to interrupt you, Kosin. I know Boldy's going to get mad that I did that. But would you read it if it was only CISA? When you tell me MIVD, AIVD, CNMF, and GCHQ were involved, I'm okay, I have to pay attention. If you tell me it's just a CISA advisory, I'm I don't have time for this shit. Just move on.
What if you say many prominent organizations? As you read through the report, the narrative, it flows from one thing to another. It comes back. Then in the middle, there's just some IOCs in XML sticks form, but it's not all the IOCs. If you go through the whole document, there's more IOCs which are not in those files. And then there's an appendix with IOCs, but not in that format. It's scratching your brain. That's the feeling. Scratching.
Imagine having to write a story in 15 minutes on deadline from that advisory.
ChatGPT, I don't know. ChatGPT, man.
ChatGPT is your friend. I mean, we have a 227 page indictment for the other one, Doppelganger. I'm not complaining about that. Lots of great info, but I mean, the USG has been getting paid by the word, I think, on this one.
Well, let's pivot to Doppelganger because it's kind of in the same wheelhouse of US versus Russia, I want to say. FBI and DOJ announced this takedown of this network of websites, Doppelganger network of websites. I'll get you to go first, Juan, because you guys did some prior work on this. I believe Alex Milenkowski did some work on Russia-aligned influence operations in Germany. The U.S. indictment here talked about RT folks trying to, pay some money for YouTubers and content creators here in the U.S. to push narrative thing. Why is this an important story? Aren't all nations doing this? The same question again. All nations are in every country doing this, influencing.
I don't think all nations are doing this. Let's start there. I think a lot more nations are doing influence operations. It's actually quite fascinating. I mean, I think they did a really great job on this one. There's a lot of material in there. Will this stop them? I'll be surprised if it even slows them down. Like if you look at Tom Hagel did a breakdown on some of that infrastructure, and there's still some of it that's not only still alive, but they have attached like Twitter accounts and everything that are still piping this stuff. Now, to the point of, do all nations do this? No. I think the issue that you get into is the same conversation we've been having since the Cold War, where the State Department used to have an active measures working group, and the reason that we have things like Voice of America and Radio Free wherever the fuck is in order to spread
U.S. propaganda. I grew up with Voice of America all over Guyana. As a kid, right? I mean, I grew up in a quote-unquote communist country where Voice of America was on our airwaves at night pushing American narratives. This is normal.
How did it differ from your local communist news?
I mean, it's not much different from what I see on RT when I travel through Europe, and RT is the only English-speaking channel on some random Czechoslovakian TV
I hate it
channel.
when we talk about things this way because, again,
I think it's cute. Juan, we have to be fair, right?
We have to be smart. We don't have to be fair. We have to be smart. I think we have a fucking problem in Western culture these days. We do have an issue where discernment has exited the conversation almost entirely. And when we lose nuance, we can make false equivalencies this way. Dude, for that same matter, if you are going to reduce all news to propaganda, then at this point, we're getting into the kind of moral equivalencies that work extremely well towards this. I love a discussion about like Doppelganger in this level of detail, because when you start to see that they need to fake the websites that they're hosting on in order to steal and co-opt the authority of other news channels, of recognizable voices, and then pay people to amplify their narratives, you can't have that conversation about this being the same as, well, you're telling one side of the story and they're telling another one. No, you're lying to me about the level of authority and respectability, verifiability and objectivity of what you're telling me in order to sell me a narrative that, as we've learned from, Thomas Ridd's excellent book on active measures, which gives us an entire history of how this shit's been going down for God knows how long, it is not just skewed. You are taking kernels of truth and wrapping them in a narrative that furthers a certain political agenda or furthers just a sense of chaos and equivalency, like the ones that we've been discussing, such that you disengage your critical thinking skills, go, well, they're saying there's two authoritative sides of this, and they're saying dissonant things that do not match with each other. I can't possibly make heads or tails of this. I cannot possibly know what the truth is. So I'm just going to disengage from the conversation. That's the real goal. There's a naive view that influence operations are trying to push a specific view of the world. At least on the Russian sort of information doctrine, no. What you want is for people to just fuck off from political discourse completely, disengage, leave things alone, don't be an active player in this, and let's move on. And a great way to do that is just to confuse you from what could possibly be going on. Oh, the Russians are doing this? Well, aren't the Americans doing that? Doesn't the CIA do that? Didn't they do that before? Well, I guess we're all the same. Let's just move on. And you're like, I'm sorry, those dudes just staged a coup in Montenegro. They stashed a bunch of weapons. Then they tried to do this in Serbia. Then they blew up a bunch of shit in Chechnya, in the Czech Republic. And then they went and poisoned somebody in the UK. What comparable actions are we talking about?
Fair. Costin, you view it as nuance? Because
So I'll give you an example.
I feel like if I ask this
Mm,
question to people in Latin America,
mhm,
Europe, Australia, Asia, you'll get different answers. I
mm,
understand Juan's
mm,
answer, and I'm in largely in agreement with him.
mm,
But I feel like to just blindly trust the US that, okay, there's nuance there and they're doing it the right way. Those guys are
mm.
always going to do it the right way is not quite. I mean, there's a whole generation of us that came through US managing coups and managing stuff that it's difficult for us to just grasp onto that conversation. Is that fair, Costin?
So, just like you, I grew up in a communist country, and we were listening to Radio Free Europe. And I remember listening to this in the evenings with my parents, and everyone was like listening in their homes with the volume, like very low volume,
Very low,
because you
yeah.
don't know who's listening.
Yeah, I listened to VOA. My parents had us in a room listening to Voice of America with the turn it down.
Absolutely.
Exactly the same experience.
And it was Romanian people who fled Romania, and they were in the States. And we saw them as, very courageous, speaking about liberty, speaking about the future for the country. And I think it actually played a very important role in the revolution and in people, just eventually getting fed up with all that and getting into the streets and getting rid of Ceausescu and the communist regime. And the interesting thing is that after the revolution, nobody listened to Radio Free Europe anymore. It was dead. Essentially, basically, nobody cared anymore. So it just
Well, what does that tell you,
completely
though?
disappeared. So that's one thing. But I also wanted to point out that the communists were trying to stop that. So they were trying all sorts of interference. Radio Free Europe was changing the frequencies, like every night on a different frequency, or like multiple frequencies, making it very difficult to stop or to interfere with. And I was thinking at the moment, Russia Today, RT, it's banned in Romania. So in Romania, you cannot visit Russia Today. It's forbidden. It's blocked at like a national level. And me as a researcher, for me, it's interesting because I like to look into that just to understand what is the current narrative, what they are trying to influence, what are their main objectives. So for me as a researcher, it's interesting. So that's why with the VPN, I can definitely visit Russia Today. I was saying I never imagined me growing up in communism with Radio Free Europe being
We have the same
essentially
almost exact experience. And every time I go to Europe and RT is the only English speaking channel on the hotel television, I always think, wow, this is really clever mind control. I mean, it's like how brilliant it is.
I
yes,
think
but
it's funny to fight for the option to be lied to, right? Like there is, in the sense, look, I don't want to sound so like pro America, rah rah. It's more like, look, American media generally sucks. It's fucking terrible. The news, what we call news in the U.S., is atrocious. But there's a difference between that and a foreign funded channel whose sole goal is to spread things that are unreliable, unsubstantiated in a certain bent. Like that idea that like we're speaking truth to power. You're like that's delightful, but that's not what I'm seeing here. Like I can see if I read 12 different versions of the same story and yours is consistently twisted in a direction that is not substantiated by the facts or the events themselves, that's a lie. That's what we used to call, being misled. That's the funny thing about sort of democracies and this notion of preserving freedoms is you take it to this ridiculous extension wherein there's like a paradox of, what was it? The paradox of intolerance, right? The idea, Western societies need to be tolerant of all things except intolerance, because at some point you need to set the line that keeps you from essentially conceptually cannibalizing yourselves. And that's the problem that we're having, is this notion of like free speech to such a degree that we need to allow others to lie to us in an equal sort of marketplace of ideas.
Right, but you're using the word lie and truth and news and propaganda. I mean, there's nuance to that, right? If you're in Russia, if you're in China, terrorist versus freedom fighter, we're having this. And like I said, I don't want the listeners to get it wrong. I generally agree with you. I just think there's like a certain level of unfairness to the conversation, just as a.
I don't think so. I think the problem is that it's such a broad sweeping conversation that it is disorienting. But the truth is not a matter of contextual subjectivity in that sense, right? Like when the Chinese government lies about what tells you about Uyghurs as these like entities hell-bent on destroying the fabric of your society, and they tell you that everything's fine and they're just in these nice little re-education camps learning to sing nice songs, and as soon as they become proper Chinese they'll be cool. That is a lie. It's a lie, and it has to do with the dissonance and the intent of the person that is telling you this narrative. And that's a difficult thing for us to accept when in this like sort of cultural relativist 21st century mentality about what it means to be objective. But we do, like, at some point you have to acknowledge that there are people who tell you untruths on purpose for a reason.
Right. And yeah, it's not often, it's not every time we have to go freedom either. I mean, like, that's also been used as an excuse over the years. It's the reason that freedom and guns and stuff is a meme whenever we talk about wars, right? Speaking of Uyghurs, let me shift. You want to put a closing thought on this, Costin?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of discussion also about the efficacy of and the effectiveness of these operations. And I was in vacation this week in Strasbourg and talked to a lot of smart people. And generally, the question was actually, how effective is Doppelganger? I mean, what are they doing? Just setting up some fake websites, using AI to write fake articles? Like, nobody's falling for that, right? And I think this indictment and this news and the fact they're like putting millions of dollars, in my opinion, it's a sign that people finally start to realize that it works. And
You
not
think
only
so?
that, I think it works. Yeah. But I mean, if you look
Well,
all
it
over
depends on the
Europe,
goal. Let me just stick a pin there, because it works if the goal is to just destabilize and have
Correct.
people just disagree with each other. That's the original goal. But the real, I mean, it's deeper. It's deeper than the surface
It
goal,
is
right?
deeper. It is deeper, and I also like to think that this is maybe Influence Operations 1.0, because Influence Operations 2.0 is coming. And I think that Influence Operation 2.0 will be something like this, where the actors actually ask the people for their opinion in real time and claim to take decisions based on those choices. So at the moment, like, every politician in the world will go out there and say, if you vote for me, I'm going to do that and that and that and that. And then people vote for them and they don't do that. Influence Operations 2.0 is when they will say, what do you guys want? Do you want like lower taxes? Vote like in this app. Just, vote yes. And then they will ask, do you want, I don't know, cheaper homes? If you want cheaper homes, vote. And as you like start voting, you suddenly get the impression that all these actions actually matter. They make a difference. And then, people really start falling for these influence operations. Because in the end, houses will not be cheaper, taxes will not be lower, it'll be the same. But that's like Influence Operations 2.0, which I think that nobody's prepared for. When everything begins with choice and ends with choice.
And the other part of Influence Operations 2.0 is AI, and the AI doing automated on the fly, creating websites on the fly, creating tweets on the fly, creating tweets and responses to live articles. Like paste a CNN article into a tool and it generates a million different things to go respond to it in real time. And I think that's where it really gets scary. Juan, a closing thought, or are you good with this?
And just like final thing is piggybacking on the illusion of choice, where you actually, vote the politicians and then they get the office. And for 4 years, there's like no good way to change any of that. So like you vote one time and that's for 4 years, you can't change anything anymore. So I think that's probably one of the flaws of democracy we have nowadays, that there's a lack of interaction between the voters and the elected officials.
I'm not sure how much I like. I'll say sort of the democracy suck. It's just slightly better than the alternatives. But I say democracy sucks particularly for the same reason that I would have piped up when you started to talk about sort of the general effectiveness of these operations, which is to say, your measure of effectiveness, it depends on what you presume the goal to be in these influence operations. And I'll put it to you in different ways, right? Like, is the thing that's valuable creating a sense of general confusion, or is it creating enough noise, or is it confusing just a few people, right? Like, what's the point of like Doppelganger pretending to be Fox News or pretending to be somebody else, right? Like, you're co-opting that legitimacy and hoping to influence, maybe a few boomers get confused. Okay, cool. However, I think if we look at the history of active measures, there were always an untold exponential amount of attempt at driving narratives, almost like spaghetti and like at the wall. And then there were a few unpredictable ones that just latched on to some aspect of society, some underrepresented group, some subculture that needed some level of whatever, some narrative that really fit their thing. And all of a sudden, this one of the 45 ridiculous anti-American narratives that you came up with gets latched onto by some unsuspecting, unexpected group of people and lives on for 50, 60 years, right? Like the CIA invented AIDS. That was an active measures operation, and it was seeded through, I believe, Pakistan. And and then it obviously it found a following in certain like African American liberation movements and like subcultures you don't normally think about. And you get people in 2024 who think that that's true.
We just went
That
through this
isn't,
with COVID and vaccines. I mean, it's like
and,
nonstop.
and it, but it's hilarious when you think about, well, if it weren't so sad, but when you think about the COVID thing, for example, the anti-vaxxers, it's funny that you can seed a narrative like that, and it can be latched onto both by subcultures in the right and the left. Like the new agey anti-vaxxers are just as rabid as some of the right, the lefty new agey anti-vaxxers and the right-wing QAnon anti-vaxxers have very little in common, but they can find a narrative, a dissenting narrative together. And it's sort of this fascinating notion of, what it is to wage a sort of conceptual warfare, to seed narratives that feed already existing rifts. And it's very hard because for us, these are things that we treat as sort of something sacrosanct in the individual space of like conceptual freedom of people sort of growing and learning and having their thoughts and feelings. Whereas like, for example, in the Russian mentality, political technology is a thing that is studied and considered a career. And it is a thing that you work on and seed as a project. So it is fascinating to look at the divergence in how you treat these things.
Pivoting quickly, we are 45 minutes in and we only talked about Russia. This is not good. It feels like we'll go a full 2 hours.
There was
here.
a mention of Uyghurs for like 5 seconds.
I was going to use the Uyghur mention to pivot to this new report from Eugenio Benincasa, who will be a LabsCon speaker, by the way, co-speaking with Dakota Carey on CTFs in China. But he has a new report out on War on the Rocks on the outsized impact of a few Chinese hackers. And they pull some data to show that there's just a handful of guys having an outsized impact on the vulnerabilities reported to the US here, including, leaving one organization and going to the other organization and seeing spikes in vulnerabilities reported there. All of this becomes very, very interesting within the context of the China's new law, I think 2 years now, where vulnerability researchers need to report bugs into a Chinese agency before, and it's caused a lot of ruckus in the vulnerability disclosure world. Are we buying this report? Are we buying the findings in this report that there's just these guys that we know about? Costin, what's your take?
So I think it's an amazing report. Maybe, I don't know, people will disagree or maybe people will agree with me, but in my opinion, it's an amazing report. And I didn't actually realize that the impact that these elite bug hunters from China is actually so big. Like, I mean, up to the point, I don't know, 80% of all the vulnerabilities reported to Microsoft come from these Chinese researchers. Between 2017 and 2023, they contribute 27%, but like that number keeps increasing.
Mm-hmm.
What I was wondering is what actually motivates them to report these vulnerabilities to the American companies. Is it like money? I mean, it can be one of several reasons. It can be money on one hand, but again, the bug bounties are not that big. Maybe it's like, few $1,000s, $10,000. But again, it's not the same kind of money that companies like Zerodium would pay for the heavy things. So it can be that. Or
career
two,
movement?
it can be more like, reputation. So the people, who keep collecting these 0 days, and they get into Microsoft most valuable, researchers out there, top 100. That's like some kind of an important career achievement. And from that moment on, if you try to sell a 0 day to one of these big companies, you have the reputation, you have everything you need, and you will be able to sell it without problems. Or is it like ideological in the sense they just want to make the internet safer? Like maybe they do too, and they actually care about the internet as a whole. And when it comes to, making a bit of money, maybe they have a lot of other 0 days they just simply don't report at all. And I think that's possibly one of the most scary scenarios in which they report so many vulnerabilities, but they have just as many that they do not report and sell. I mean, that's, I think, in my opinion, the most scary option.
The report names two guys, Zinuo Han and Chang Wang, accounting for 50% of all their contributions, including, he left Qihu 360 and went to Alibaba, and all of a sudden Qihu's contributions dropped, Alibaba spiked. So the argument is that there's like a handful of guys who are really, really aggressive. Just on Costin's point there, Juan, what percentage of all Chinese found vulnerabilities you think we actually get eyeballs on?
I think it's going to be tragically low. And I would suggest that the same ratio probably applies to vulnerabilities in the US, right? Like there's a notion in which we have to consider we value O-Days and the discovery of vulnerability in a way that is not accurate or not matched to how vulnerability researchers see and value vulnerabilities. Like for us, there's a sort of like policy-minded scarcity mentality to it, wherein we want to look at it as if these things are rare, they are extremely valuable, they should be treated in a kind of sacrosanct way where they only come once in a blue moon. And vulnerability researchers don't look at it that way. They know that not only have they found, let's say, 50 of these bugs, but also they know that this one component where they found that one bug is so poorly made that when this gets burned, they have probably 12 other bugs in the same component that they can come back. And so like there's just a very different mentality. Similarly, like we've been talking so much about wars of ideas and sort of like in a way, the notion of reporting bugs and vulnerability disclosure, responsible disclosure, it's almost like we're trying to sell a sort of ethical narrative that is not natural in the vulnerability research or discovery space. That was not the way things were done before, and it's not necessarily the way you want to do things. And frankly, when you see the way that like Apple, Microsoft, some of these other companies act towards the disclosure of new vulnerabilities, where they don't want to pay, they're not responsive, they claim a POC doesn't work when it does work, they claim that they had already discovered it before, so it's not worth, we're not giving you money. It really doesn't sell this idea that it's actually worth it, that you should be acting above board. Theoretically, you could be taking that vuln and selling it for 5x, or just using it yourself and being God in some very small portion of the internet. So in a sense, I'm sure we're only seeing a fraction of the vulns that are being discovered by these Chinese groups, and God knows how many other amazing Chinese hackers, vulnerability researchers are out there that like we've never heard their freaking names before. But I would posit, just from some of the discussions I've had with really great vuln researchers in the US and in the West, I'm sure a similar ratio applied to everywhere else. And we are treating the things we see as if they're amazing, and in some ways they are, but I don't think they're as scarce as we want to think they are.
I'm showing a Farm Poet Twitter thread up on the screen here with digging into Chinese discovered vulnerabilities here in the US, and the 598 out of 1474 analyzed CVEs were reported by Chinese nationals or companies. 40% of all published vulnerabilities for Windows x64. It's startling. The idea that they're taking the lead. Is that accurate, or is this just because we're looking and we're nervous and there's a lot of reporting on what's happening in China? Is there some nervousness that China has taken the lead and ran past American researchers at finding and reporting vulnerabilities? Do we care?
I mean, to what extent is this accounted for just by the law of large numbers? Like, how many people in China are like just more STEM capable, more qualified, more working in this space when like in the US we struggle to find 10 universities that are producing competent technical people. Like you have
Why
like
not India then?
RPI. I won't speak to the Indian educational system, technological system. Yes, they write a lot of software, whatever, but it's not necessarily known for its quality. As opposed to, you have a different level of education when it comes to like, for example, when we talk about hiring low-level engineers, right? If you've ever worked in the AV space, you talk about hiring low-level engineers, chances are you want to look at Russia, Israel, and a few parts of like Eastern Europe, where you just so happen to get the kind of people who learned assembly in high school and they just understand those machines at a different level. Not to overgeneralize, but a lot of those people tend to suck at cloud and distributed systems, but they're phenomenal at low level kernel development, exploit development, etc. You do have to account for like the background and education to some extent. And like what I was gonna say before is like we have very few schools in the US that will effectively teach you how to do any of that stuff. There's a lot of cybersecurity programs and blah blah blah, but like if you tell me that I have to look at a new grad and say this person might actually be good at vulnerability research, they might actually be a good reverser. So it's what, like RPI, and like Carnegie
RPI
Mellon,
yeah.
right? Like you've got like 3-4 places.
Let me put a little wrinkle here as well. Just yesterday, the ONCD director, Harry Coker, announced that the US will remove the four-year degree requirement for most cybersecurity jobs, but they said some cybersecurity jobs as a part of filling this 500,000 shortage of skills. Does that make things worse? The point you're just making, Juan?
No, not at all. No,
You're a fan of that move?
It's about time.
Aren't we dumbing down or let's
I mean, I'm sorry, out of the three of us, who has a cybersecurity degree?
I dropped out of high school, bro.
Okay.
Not me.
I'm a philosophy major. I think you chemistry. How many people that we've worked with who are brilliant have GEDs, never went to college, have no graduate degrees? And like we talk about this a lot actually at CISA, because one of the brilliant things that Thomas Rid, with the help and blessing of Dmitry Alperovich, were able to do for the Alperovich Institute that has made it so different than a lot of other places is we've been finding ways around this like ridiculous need to have PhDs be the only people who can come and teach students. There are very few PhDs, especially PhDs in comp sci, who have anything valuable to say in this space. So why are those the only people that can teach? And like we have this pipeline problem of like not having talent. There's no programs, there's no teachers. How dare you turn away talented people because they didn't go to the right college or they didn't finish high school? Like we're not in a position to, make those decisions.
I don't know. I'm worried a little bit, not only with this, we're just going on like certifications and so on, but we're generating a whole new generation of programmers and cybersecurity people who are ChatGPT only, LLM only, with no deep understanding of the tech stack and a deep understanding of the layers where the real action is happening. We'll get to a point a year from now where it's not going to be a skills shortage, it's going to be a ability shortage.
No, I think, look, man, I don't think that's the right way to look at it. It gives credit to universities that universities do not currently deserve. You're not training people that well in colleges. All you're doing is turning out people with greater debt that are going to take these jobs, right? Like if you tell me your kid figured out how to do some reversing at 19 and he's never gone to college, I will take that guy 10,000 times over some Harvard new grad who thinks they're absolutely brilliant in comp sci and writes CISA level YARA rules. That is just not the right side of looking at this. When we talk about a skills shortage, it's not because you have a lack of willing people. It's a inability to level up. Like, I know folks who are good at IT who want to get into cybersecurity, and you really don't know where to direct them.
How does this fix it though? Like, I don't understand how removing the degree requirement makes things better. We're working on quantity and not quality.
No. What the fuck does a degree have to do with quality in our space?
I don't want to belabor the point. Costin, you got a thought on this?
Yeah, I spent 10 years in university, never finished it, but I was thinking that during those 10 years, you know what was the most important thing was like all the friends that I made and all the brilliant people, you know, that I met that also didn't finish, by the way, simply because the focus was on like really silly stuff that nobody cared about, like mechanics, physics, the type of mathematics that, you know, I never used. Electrotechnics, I remember going to seminars where the teachers were essentially yelling at us. We were moving some huge coils with like huge levers, and they were yelling like faster, like this is a kind of thing that you'll be doing all your entire life. So get pushing, obviously.
What was
The focus was wrong. Computer science, my friend. That was computer science, and we were like rotating levers and pushing
kids these
coils.
days have never rotated levers or pushed coils, and they think
I know,
they deserve
right?
jobs.
Filters, yeah, doing filters. So yeah, the focus is wrong there, and I think, but this is like such a huge bit of worm, so I don't, you know, I don't want to jump in there. But
the
saying
over
that
reliance on ChatGPT and LLMs on folks not learning the basics, but just having an automated tool do it for them, I worry about the long-term deeper implications there.
I think you're thinking about this completely wrong.
Okay.
I think you are thinking about this completely wrong, and I'll tell you this: like the biggest issue we have is actually not having a way to figure out the quality of skills of the people that you bring in. That's your big problem, especially if you're worried about LLMs or ChatGPT, because it becomes a Turing style. If it's a Turing style problem, that like how do you call it? Like if we have a sort of imitation game style approach to whether you are skilled or not, we have a bigger problem here, which is I'm hiring right now. I get 200 applicants. All of them claim to have been threat intel experts, researchers, do this, that, and the other. You're like, they don't know how to do shit. And they all have college degrees and they have every certification known to man. They don't know how to do anything. At the same time, when you do get some incredibly skilled person with no degree, it often is better to see like, oh, look at their blog with all their reversing notes and look at this, that, and the other, and they display discernment. We give them a test, they can do it live. Cool. The problem that you have especially for the US government, where it's like the blind leading the blind, is how do you signify to those people that these are skilled individuals and these are not? And keep in mind that like, if we let's say, take every speaker that's going to LabsCon, right? Presumably, every LabsCon speaker is a not just highly skilled individual, but at the top of their fucking game, objectively. How many of them could get hired into the US government? How many of them would you be able to, on paper, signify this is an expert at the top of their fucking game? And, you know, the mismatch you're going to have between college degrees of completely differing specializations, people with no degrees, people who, you know, led lives that you're like would dismiss on spec. And those folks are some of the best individuals ever. I think it goes to show that we do not know how to signify value. We do not know how to discern expertise. And frankly, for the pipeline problem, we don't even know where to direct people to learn things well. Is it SANS? You need $30,000 worth of SANS courses? I don't think so.
Last week, right as we finished recording, Microsoft put out a threat intel report on the Citrine Sleet, North Korean threat actor using Chromium 0 days. We've seen the North Koreans use O days in the past, but it seems there was some surprise online to find that the North Korean actors burning 0-day chains, Chrome 0-day chains on crypto bank robberies, like to do crypto heists. Is this something we really should pay attention to? And I go back to an earlier question I asked. Have we underestimated the North Koreans in terms of where they appear on the Magic Quadrant of, you know, ability versus completeness of vision. Where do you, Costin, jump in here and tell me how does this change the way we view the North Koreans?
I mean, yeah, I think the story probably started back in the days with the Sony Pictures hack, and then the Bangladesh bank heist, and people started realizing that North Koreans were getting better. Then the numbers, came public, and we realized there's 8,000 people in the military units associated with things like Lazarus, and yeah, 8,000 people. That's serious numbers. And as they get better and better over the years, they acquire 0 days, they expand their targeting, they do WannaCry, obviously. Then they start targeting security researchers with 0 days, which to me, I think was a point when everyone realized that this is not a joke. I mean, I know people who were, I would say, pretty decent, pretty good people, knowledgeable people who got owned through 0 days and all sorts of tricks by Lazarus. And yeah, I think that this is something serious that you need to care about, especially when they bring the Chrome 0 days. That essentially all it takes for any of us is if we use Chrome, which I don't, but if you do, simply visiting that website and you're owned, like it's game over.
It's crazy how we went from telling everyone to use Chrome, it's the most secure browser that updates itself, and we went through this whole thing about Google being the more likely organization to secure a browser. To every freaking day I have to refresh Chrome because they're patching 0 days. You're not using Chrome. That's another issue. Juan, are we underrating the North Koreans?
I will say that I was, and actually Kosin was the one that made me realize that I was wrong. There's having worked on before we even called it Lazarus, right? Like if you remember, Kosin, we worked before Operation Blockbuster, and like I did some work with Jaime Blasco
Spaspe.
back in the day. Yeah, Spaspe, and like all these different components. The old school version of this was very interesting, but it was not characterized by immense skill. And I think there's sort of this mentality to it where you go, look, they're doing interesting things, more so because they have a different remit and a lack of just general restraint. So they're willing to take on chances and do things that, are so audacious and ridiculous, same as the Iranians, where you go, wow, like, yeah, that's fucking stupid, but wow, that they nailed it. Amazing. And I think I was left with that mentality for a lot longer than I should have, right? I think to me, the realization that the game was being stepped up, it was that I was confused that this was the North Koreans, were the Swift hacks. Right? When you see Blue Noroff break off and you start to see them actually, like, it was a stupid thing to try to do the way they did it, right? $93 million at once, and you can't spell Bangladesh. Stupid. However, the components were good, the way they did it was good, the way they studied the target was good, and they did get away with it. And so, eventually we found out they were in multiple banks, and in some cases they had been able to steal money. But that wasn't the moment where I figured out that I was completely wrong about them. It was when Kosin started to point at some of these crypto hacks, and you go, dude, they're finding exploits in these really
smart contracts.
It's smart, intricate components for smart contracts, and they're looking at the way that the compilers work for those, and you go, that is not some half-assed, dumb kid who's just trying to steal some money. The problem that you have is if we had some multi-quadrant version of designating the skills of a threat actor, you would basically say we are seeing them rise up in technical capability. They have an unbelievable sort of audacity or wiliness factor that's always been high. They are still not strategic. They're still kind of fucking stupid when it comes to how they leverage the accesses they get. And I think 3CX was a great example of that. You hit 3CX, you have this downstream supply chain attack with thousands of enterprises. And I can tell you firsthand, some of them were incredibly valuable organizations. And what do they do with it? They hit, a dozen crypto exchanges. What the fuck are you doing? That is Bush
That's the goal,
League.
though. That was the goal, right?
Sure, but it's Bush League ridiculous, right? The same, you gain strategic access en masse, solar wind style access. and you use it to hit a dozen cryptocurrency exchanges, like, sure, you're going to make some money out of it. Great. But what are you doing? Like, how is that the best version? Like, these operations are not optimized. Let's just say that. They're inefficient. You get unbelievable access, you burn it for a stupid goal. That's the part that's kind of missing in that. Not that I want them to get better, but that is kind of the baffling, kind of paradox of seeing them skill up on the technical side, but still have really dumb basic goals.
You share that sentiment, Costin, that they're still
I mean,
rather dumb?
do not underestimate hunger. And in North Korea, hunger is a very powerful thing. I mean, like everywhere else.
Existential.
And I was talking to some of like the really top experts in North Korean threads, like Seong-Soo Park, former colleague of ours, is in my opinion one of the top experts. I think that in the discussion, somebody mentioned that if these guys don't bring enough per week, I don't know, like $10,000 stolen, $10,000 per week, then they starve. Like their family starve, and they simply get kicked out of this, let's say, semi-privileged position. So in their case, it's life and death. It's hunger, and if you don't do the theft, the stealing, and if you're not creative enough, then you starve. And I think this is like a very, very powerful and very convincing reality, if you want.
Speaking of Seong-Soo,
Well,
go, Juan.
I was just going to say, I mean, you're completely right, Kosan. But I think you shouldn't underestimate the power of hunger as a motivator, but also as a very one-dimensional motivator, right? You are trying to hit your goals for your safety, the safety of your family, but that isn't the kind of motivator that takes you to improve upon the mission, decide to do something bigger, more audacious, more long-term valuable. And I mean, that makes sense for what we're seeing. If your big thing is not, I'm going to do this thing that's going to bring some strategic targets in, some super valuable intel, fly under the radar, no one's going to notice we were there, amazing stuff. But instead, nah, man, I need to hit my $10,000 quota, and that's good enough. I think that matches the kind of operations that we're seeing from them. They're hitting their quotas, right?
Let me mention, you mentioned Seong-Soo. Seong-Soo had a tweet here about Korean-speaking threat actors being on fire with ODAs, and it's not only Citrine Sleek, which is listed on this here as known as North Korean, but we've seen South Korean. Are these the Dark Hotel guys, Costin? This APT C60 and APT Q12? What is the relevance of like everyone using ODA against each other in that part of the world?
It looks like that's both of them Dark Hotel. Actually, I discussed this with Seong-Soo. At least we know that APT-Q-12, because I think they say in the blog that this was previously associated with Dark Hotel. APT-C60, the other one, I don't know if is like 100% attribution to Dark Hotel, but it certainly looks like. Or there's another threat actor, IPT, coming out of South Korea.
That's an active part of the world, right, Costin, for malware activity?
Not just malware activity, but also zero-day development. I mean, over the years, Dark Hotel, they got caught like so many times, correct, by Clem. And that, again, it only suggests that they are like super good at finding these 0 days and deploying. I don't think hunger is the point there. But simply going back to the other point with the North Korean, I was thinking like, God forbid that you become part of their meal. Yeah, maybe there's a lack of strategy, but I mean, yeah, if you become their meal, then you're in trouble.
Some closing thoughts, Juanito, on North Korea, South Korea?
It's a really weird evolution of a frozen conflict. Like the North Koreans have been hitting South Korea aggressively since like 2007 or 8.
Earlier, maybe, yeah.
Earlier, in all kinds of ways. And it's sort of interesting to see that arm keep beefing up and taking on more things. In some ways, I'm glad they're not getting smarter at some things. In others, I'm kind of fascinated that they are getting this unbelievable talent and yet squandering it. Look, let them do it, right? I'm not going to correct them, but it's interesting to see what a frozen cyber conflict can look like, right? You're not seeing escalation in the way that might suggest you actually want to cause sabotage and destruction, It's this sort of death by 1,000 cuts, at least in one direction. And on the other hand, what you see is the kind of skill of a technologically hyper advanced nation with a proper recruitment pipeline that comes with mandated military service. And you see a whole different caliber of threat actor coming out of South Korea, the kind of folks who will eventually be freed to engage much more fruitful careers in StarCraft 2. But just it's fascinating to see like such a close proximity, somewhat have to be relatively similar cultures, though obviously not the same, and what it yields by way of tradecraft and organizational capability and just the way that they go about their ops. Like that is a fascinating mirror that somebody should study.
Costin, what browser are we using now?
What exploit do we
Yeah,
serve you with?
all of them. Every day a different one. Absolutely.
No, in all seriousness, you're rotating through browsers as a mitigation strategy.
I am. I think the browser alone by itself is one thing, but you need to essentially lock it down as much as possible. Make sure you don't hit the internet through your typical IP address. Go through redirect all the traffic to random proxies, like every time through VPNs. Have like
Proxmox.
all sorts of
The cool kid
plugins and
stuff.
ad filters installed. Have different browsers for like company projects and visiting the internet. Use Tor as much as possible. Use virtual machines, and even
Is
then,
that over paranoia, Juan?
Oh, I won't say over paranoia, just what's your goal? All right.
Fair.
don't become the meal of the North Korean hackers.
All right, I'm gonna leave
And
it
while
right
at it,
there.
while at it, I was just thinking, like, is there maybe a parallel here between like the film industry of a country and their hacking scene? I mean, there's a bunch of TV shows coming out of South Korea, right? I mean, Squid Games, probably season 2 coming soon. I don't know. Are you guys watching any of those shows? No,
No,
We're
Costin.
not consuming South
Not
Korean
all of
media
us are on
these days.
vacation every freaking week, Costin, with Netflix time.
it's cultural enrichment, like it's education if you want.
It's re-education.
But yeah,
Closing
like
thoughts. I'm gonna put a bow on this podcast.
Why do you have to close us off every time? People want longer podcasts, Ryan.
We're an
Let
hour
us
and
talk
17
shit.
minutes in. We're an hour and 17 minutes in. I'll let you close. Juanito, close with some shout outs. Who do you want to shout out this week?
I mean, phenomenal work from everybody. I have to say, obviously, the Doppelganger indictment is actually really interesting. I would have, I might have been dismissive, but no, fascinating amounts of work. I hope there's a lot of follow up from the, your Bellingcat folks, your OSINT folks, your Kristen Del Rosos and Dakota Carries, who will actually go run down some of these companies. There's a lot of leads, right? Like the indictment actually provides you with a lot of leads to move forward. On the other end, looking at some, we might have chat on CISA's YARA rules and whatnot, but phenomenal work by MIVD, AIVD, GCHQ, the Czech, the CNMF guys, like the kind of folks that must have really, that must have really substantiated this kind of operation. And frankly, I mean, we can laugh about it and we can name it something cute like Cadet Blizzard or whatever you want to call it. But
shout out to Microsoft. They did amazing work tagging that early.
They did amazing work tagging that early, and I have a feeling they've done even more amazing work than that. So shout out to them on that. But let's also not caricaturize and downplay what we're talking about. It is the cyber component of it is but a finger in the hand of a truly horrifying way of going about warfare. I mean, it might be coming out of military intelligence, but going about sort of gray zone operations in the free world and undermining a lot of countries that have done nothing worse than to just support a democracy of so yeah, we can laugh about it, but I think what we are seeing is horrifying and should hopefully serve as not just a cautionary tale, but actually a call to arms to say we need to take this shit more seriously and actually do something about it. And because of the indictment, all they've done is open our eyes, but it has not actually muted or sort of neutered their power in any way. I think that's where we all need to sort of take up the torch and move forward.
Costin, final shout outs. And is there a closing question?
I think, it's very difficult to find more prominent people than the ones that Juan mentioned. But I was thinking that there's a bunch of very interesting events coming up. There's LabsCon, and there's Virus Bulletin beginning of October, Code Blue later in Japan. So I just wanted to say, like, shout out to all the people who are presenting at these events, trying to better our understanding of different threat actors, exposing themselves to risks sometimes by, blowing the whistle on different things, dangerous things. So respect to all those people, and of course to the people who put together these conferences. So hats off to you, Ryan, Juan, and all the others for
Man, I hope we get accepted to Code Blue. I want to go 3 for 3 on the ones you just mentioned. Hopefully, because I hear we're dragging Ryan out to Dublin so we can record a live version of the Three Buddy podcast.
It's
It'll be
freaking
amazing.
15 hours from Phoenix, Arizona. I'm too old for those long trips anymore.
Bro,
I hear about Japan and Europe, and it's just too much.
25 hours to Taiwan for me. It was 25 hours.
Devotion for the mission, man. You got to come record with us in person.
From a
Bye,
pub
guys.
in
Talk to you
Dublin.
guys next week.
Peace.